the newsagents.
One of the things I've found most difficult this year is being honest about the scale of the crisis in the NHS, the fact it's not the envy of the world, it's a service, not a shrine, and it needs to modernise or it will die.
Not the envy of the world, not a shrine. It's got to modernise or die. This is the National Health Service. And it sounds like it could be one of those right-wing think tanks saying this about why the NHS has to fundamentally change. But this is Wes Streeting, the Shadow Health Secretary, and potentially next year, the Health Secretary.
Today, we're going to hear from Labour's Wes Streeting on what it's like to be put in charge of not a department so much as a religion. We'll hear about his death threats. We'll hear him truthfully tell us what Keir Starmer should be saying about Gaza and what Labour should be paying people in the health and social care sector. Welcome to the Newsagents. Wes, I think we want to go in at the deep end with you a bit, because if Labour win the next election, whenever that is, you will inherit not a department so much as a religion, in a way, an ideology. The esteem in which the NHS is held is so profound and so sort of tangible for this country. I wonder if it makes it debilitating for discourse. Does it make it hard to have an honest chat about what it's not getting right?
Well, Merry Christmas. It's really good to be. One of the things I've found most difficult this year is being honest about the scale of the crisis in the NHS, the fact it's not the envy of the world, it's a service, not a shrine, and it needs to modernise or it will die, without the people who work in it feeling beaten up. And that feeling like they're being criticised, because staff morale is on the floor. People are feeling really, I think, anxious about the future of the NHS, and that's both the people who work in it and the patients who use it. But I don't think I'd be doing anyone any favours, and I certainly wouldn't be putting together a serious plan for a Labour government if we simply did the old-time religion of we love the NHS. The NHS is brilliant. The NHS, wasn't Nye Bevan great? Let's do party political broadcasts with, a bit of sepia and talk about the great 1945 generation. I mean, all of those things are true. I mean, I'm very proud of the fact that it was a Labour government that created the NHS. The NHS saved my life. And all of us, even when we've experienced those long waits or we've seen the NHS at its worst, also see brilliant, caring people doing their best. So I'm not going to relent in 2024 in making the case for reform and setting out how Labour will go about it. And one of the things that I think has changed in the 2 years that I've been the Shadow Health and Social Care Secretary, beyond the 5 people I've shadowed in that time in government, which is bizarre when you think about it. The reform conversation is different now, and I do find the people who work in the NHS who were previously saying, oh, please don't talk about reform, we hate that word, are now saying, yes, it needs to change. And a lot of my critique of the NHS comes from the people who work in it as well as the people who use it.
When you say that the NHS is not the envy of the world, you've been travelling. Have you seen better health systems than the NHS?
Oh, you can look at the OECD
table. What should we be jealous of?
I don't think there is one health system where you would say, right, we're going to take that country and we're going to, import the whole model and that will sort out the NHS. But there are, around the world, countries that are doing things differently and well. So I've just come back from Australia and Singapore. In Australia, the Labour government there has introduced a new set of urgent care centres, what we're calling neighbourhood health centres, that we want to adopt here in our country, and they are alleviating pressure on GPs and also diverting people away from A&E, which is crucial, because if you get a GP appointment, if you're lucky enough, that costs the NHS 40 quid. If you don't and you end up in A&E, that costs £400. So you can see it's not just worse for the patient in terms of the inconvenience, it's worse for the taxpayer too.
So in Australia, most people don't see their GP for free. There are some doctors who do what they call bulk appointments, and they are free, but you can never get on a list, and you wait weeks and weeks and weeks to see a GP. Most people pay a small amount to see the GP. Would you welcome a system like that to alleviate the financial pressure on the NHS?
No, see, I do support very strongly an NHS that's publicly funded and free at the point of use. And I mean, it doesn't matter how many times I say I don't want to privatise the NHS and I'll never charge for it. You know, there are still...
Privatise is a very, big, bad word, but there are lots of systems we know, like the Irish system or the Australian system, where it's about insurance, where you're not literally paying the price that you would if it was a private practitioner, but you might be paying a £20 supplement or something that would make it easier for people to get appointments if they needed them and could afford them.
Yeah, see, I don't think it's the model of funding that's gone wrong with the NHS. I think it's where the money is spent and how we organise care in this country. And that's the lesson I take from other countries. And when you look at the OECD spending tables and you compare Britain with comparable countries, we're almost top of the charts for spending in hospitals. But then you look at primary care, general practice and those sorts of things, community services, mental health, social care, diagnostics and capital investment, and we're either near the bottom, at the bottom, or seriously lagging behind. So what we need is a big shift out of the hospital into the community, from an analogue health service to a digitally data-driven health service, and from a sickness service to a healthcare system that is focused on prevention and keeping people well. Because what we have in common with lots of other countries is, rising ageing population, rising chronic disease, and rising cost pressures. And if we're not careful, that demand will overwhelm the NHS and the financial pressures will bankrupt the NHS.
So why isn't your social health care plan then the first thing that you've got to offer us? If you know that that's where all the stresses come from, keeping people in hospital who don't need to be in hospital, looking after an ageing population, looking after people who need to be back in the community, why haven't we seen the Wes Streeting social care?
We've made some important commitments on social care so far and care in the community. For example, as well as increasing the number of nurses in our country, we want to double the number of district nurses qualifying, so there is more care in the community. And at the social care end of the spectrum, the most immediate crisis is the workforce crisis. We're going to have a 10-year plan for social care and a workforce plan that's aligned with the NHS workforce plan, so we see the two systems working together more.
Which presumably means you do have to start having a very honest conversation about immigration, that the workforce has to come from a place of people who want to come in. How many of the changes that Rishi Sunak made last week would you stand by in terms of getting a workforce in to look after our social care
What I'd say
needs?
to the Prime Minister is it's a perfectly reasonable thing to do to want to reduce the level of net migration in this country, because I think people are rightly looking at the levels of net migration with alarm and thinking, well, where's the infrastructure in terms of housing, transportation, public services? How are we going to provide that?
No dependents, no spouse to those care workers.
Yeah, what you've got to do, as well as in order to bring the numbers down, it's not just about changing the rules, it's about reducing the demand. And in health and care, there has been an over-reliance on overseas workers in both the health and social care system because this country hasn't bothered to do its homegrown talent.
So you think we can do that as a homegrown? You want to see social care,
but you've got to phase that, and that's where I think the Tories go so horribly wrong so often, because of the ideological pressure they're under. And Rishi Sunak is unquestionably a hostage of any one of the five families at any one time. He has to say these things, make these commitments that he knows are implausible and unachievable, rather than have a serious plan and a process to get the country to where it wants to be in terms of net migration.
You must speak to care home owners, managers around the country in your Ilford constituency. Do they find that they cannot recruit British people?
It's a massive challenge, because and also
British people don't want to become care workers.
Also,
they don't want to do bedpans
for the most part.
It's not so much. I think it's not even so much the bedpans bit. I think it's that it is a highly skilled job. It is a very demanding and rewarding job, but you can get less stress and more pay working up the road at Aldi. So that's what people are increasingly doing. And actually a lot of the care workers go and work in the NHS as well, because the pay is better. So we've got to have, which is why Angela Rayner and I, and bear in mind Angie's a former care worker herself, we've committed to negotiating the first ever fair pay agreement in our country in the social care sector, so that we can start to get the social care workforce on a journey towards a level of parity with NHS
So fair pay means
staff.
what? A massive increase in the wages of social care workers.
we definitely need to deal with the wages. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to do the recruitment and retention. And what this government does often is throw good money after.
I mean, should we be paying double what we pay to care workers now?
We definitely need to, over time, raise the floor of pay in care, and also have a career structure in place so people can imagine a whole career spent in social care and working up to leadership in the way they do in the NHS. That does take time. And
Labour would pledge to spend money on those salaries, like maybe doubling the salaries of people working in social care to give them that sense of permanence and that sense of career
fair
structure.
pay agreements need to be negotiated with employers, and we've got to be clear, honest about the fact that there is a cost associated with it. One of my frustrations is what the government has been doing is actually putting quite a lot of money into social care, but it's often short-termist, last minute, and it hasn't made a jot of difference on delayed discharges. They would have been better off putting that money into the workforce and into a social care workforce plan, because at the moment 1 in 9 people in hospital are medically fit for discharge, but there isn't the care in the community. That's the equivalent of more than 24 hospitals at any one time.
Have you said to Rachel Reeves, we just got to have more money for the NHS and healthcare? And it's not, I mean, I know you've made the argument it's about redistribution. You've just said about social care, you need to pay people a lot more. If you're going to pay people a lot more, there's a limit to how far the non-DOM's tax is going to go.
Yeah, well, the non-DOM money is very clearly earmarked for specific pledges.
So therefore
in
you
the
need
NHS.
further investment.
Well, and look, this is not, I think it's so easy to kind of say, have you said to Rachel Reeves, as if, she's the Grinch who's stolen Christmas for all of us in the shadow cabinet as we sort of suffer under her fiscal discipline. Actually, look, even if Rachel said, do you know what, I want to turn the taps on, I'm going to have a complete personality transplant and be this big spending chancellor, she could turn the tap on, but the water tank's empty. So Rachel's got the full support of the shadow cabinet with the very disciplined approach she's taking on fiscal policy. But
do you think when Blair did that and stole Gordon Brown's budget, famously, that was the right thing to do, or did it lead to inefficient spending?
Well, I was just thinking, I wonder how any of us would fare if we stole Rachel Reeves' budget if we won the general election.
But seriously, Wes,
I think
because
that
was done with an increase of 8% a year above inflation for the whole of the Blair second term. Is that what we're going to see from you? I mean, can you do what you want to do without that investment, without borrowing, without investment?
Well, a couple of things. One is, I think it says a lot about Rachel and her priorities, that despite not having made many spending commitments at all, she's made significant commitments on the NHS. We'll have more to say in the new year, by the way, about social care and how we avoid falling into the same traps this country's fallen into for more than a decade now of bad politics and no reform. The second thing I'd say is...
But it's about something just wider, bigger than that, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, are you prepared to do... If you think the Blair model of spending on the NHS was the right one, will you go that far? Will you say, yes, we're going to invest whatever it takes, 8% a year above inflation was what they were doing?
On spending, the next government, and I hope it will be a Labour government, is going to have a challenge far greater than it was in 1997 in terms of the state of the economy and the state of the public finances, thanks a bunch Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak and the Conservative clown show that has absolutely trashed the public finances. So it is going to be difficult, and that's why I've had to be very hard on the fact that the NHS is going to have to reform, and reform has to do more of the heavy lifting than it did last time round. But the second thing I'd say as a point of principle, even if the public finances weren't in this mess, the NHS would need to reform and modernise if it's to survive and be sustainable for the longer term. And as I said, it's because I'm committed to the NHS and its founding principles that I'm determined to make sure it's sustainable for the long term.
Totally get the need for reform. The IFS is saying that 3.6% a year above inflation is needed for the NHS just to fulfil the workforce plan that you stand by, that you've accepted as necessary. That's an extra 6 billion a year. Over a 5-year parliament, that's 30 billion. So where does that come from? Because, the non-dom tax at best gives you, 3 billion a year? Where does the rest come from just to get to a place where you, Keir, has said you want to see that workforce plan in place?
Well, it's why Labour's number one focus and mission for government will be getting growth back into the economy, because one of the reasons the last Labour government...
So you admit you will have to spend that much?
Well, one of the reasons the last Labour government was able to invest in our public services was because the economy was growing at a far greater rate than it has under the last 13 years of Conservative
government. So spending
government.
6 billion a year doesn't sound like the wrong sum for you to be spending then on the workforce plan?
The IFS would also haul us over hot coals if we started making big spending commitments without saying where the money's going to come from. We've got to be disciplined about this. We are being careful about our choices. And again, this comes back to the long-term sustainability point on the NHS, because over 40% of day-to-day government spending now goes on the NHS. As a percentage of government spending, I wouldn't want to see that rise as a proportion of government spending much higher, because it begins to look unsustainable. And when money is tight and when choices are difficult, every penny you put into one area is an opportunity cost potentially in another area.
But you have to admit, Wes, that you're not going to do that just with the non-dom tax. That only gets you halfway there, and that's just on workforce plans.
Well, we've got to get growth back into the economy as well, and that's why it's Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer's number one priority, because if the economy had grown under the Conservatives at the same rate it had done under the last Labour government, there would be tens of billions of pounds more to spend on public services. No, but that's why they've failed the fundamental test on growth. And we're in the worst of all worlds now, where we've got low growth, high inflation, high interest rates, low productivity, and the kicker is high taxes. People in this country feel like they're paying more and getting less. And they're not going mad. They are paying more and getting less, because...
Well, you could just say we're in such a dire state that we are going to have to make the commitment to borrow, to invest in something that is really important to this whole nation.
Well, I think, we've, in terms of Rachel Reeves' fiscal rules, we're in exactly the right place. And we are having to be really disciplined about the commitments we make. And, one of the reasons why Labour has lost 4 general elections in a row is because in every single one of those elections, under different leaders, people question whether they could trust us with the money. And we are not going to make that mistake again.
We'll be back with Wes Streeting just after the break. And the Shadow Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, is still with us. I heard you on the radio the other morning and being asked about waiting lists and whether you would commit to a number on reducing waiting lists by X, and you didn't want to do that. I just want to ask, why don't you want to make a target of that? Is it a silly thing to have a target for reducing waiting lists?
We've got a number of targets. What I'm really mindful of, we've just been talking about the shortage of money. Let's talk about the other fundamental problem in politics at the moment, which is the shortage of trust. And I think people are fed up to the back teeth of promises being made before an election and then being broken or discarded or forgotten after an election. So we're thinking in terms of our manifesto and the commitments and the pledges we make, not just about whether they can be afforded, but also whether they can be delivered, and making sure that every pledge in our manifesto is fully costed, fully funded and achievable, because we want to get to a point, and thinking about the future of health and social care.
But is it a stupid target? Is it a stupid target to say we want to...
I want to cut waiting lists, of course I do, and I anticipate they will be lower after the first term of a Labour government. But
then under a Labour government, what you saw when Tony Blair was Prime Minister was you saw everyone had a target of 26 weeks or whatever it was, and they were performing operations that weren't surgically necessary to hit a target, rather than doing what was surgically essential.
You've got to think carefully about your targets. We have made specific commitments, and particularly on waiting times, we want to get those back to 18 weeks by the end of the first term of a Labour government. But just back to the fundamental point about the future of health and social care, it's taken more than a decade for the Conservatives to break the NHS to the worst crisis in its history, and they've done nothing on social care. It's going to take at least a decade, just to get the NHS back on its feet, which I hope would be at the end of the first term, but fit for the future, which is a decade of reform. In order to get permission for a decade of reform, you need to win a second term, and we're not going to win a second term unless we've achieved the pledges and promises we made in the first term. So we're thinking really carefully about our manifesto so that we can look people in the eye on the doorstep and say every pledge in here is a pledge that's fully costed, fully funded, and we will deliver. And then in 4 years' time, 5 years' time, at the next election, we can knock on the doors and say, we said and we did. And now we'd like permission to carry on. We've got a job to rebuild Britain, but also to rebuild trust in politics.
You've talked about trust in politics. You've talked about being able to stand up for what you believe in and being principled in terms of what you present to the public. I want to talk to you about the situation in Gaza, where it seemed to me that after the attack on October the 7th, Keir Starmer was right behind Rishi Sunak on saying, Israel has a right to defend itself. Then when there's a humanitarian pause and Rishi Sunak calls for it, so does Keir Starmer. Now we've seen the Tories say that there needs to be a sustainable ceasefire. And we've got Keir Starmer saying there needs to be a sustainable ceasefire. It seems that you're following, not leading on in any of this. Do you think that you needed to show more leadership?
Well, I'll say a couple of things. Firstly, Keir in an interview on Radio 4 last week was talking about the need for a sustainable ceasefire. The second thing is, I think it's fair to say that we have sought not to make foreign policy a partisan issue wherever possible, because, we're thinking about the partners we would want to work with if we were in government after the next general election, the long-standing relationships and friendships, as well as the adversaries this country has, and wanting to behave in a responsible way now in the way we would were we elected after the general election. So that's been the approach.
Do you think you've got it right?
I think
have you felt comfortable with the messaging?
I have. I think what I am uncomfortable with is the way this war has unfolded. I will never forget the immediate aftermath of 7/10 and the images we saw coming out of Israel following Hamas's barbaric attack. Images we saw because Hamas filmed them and wanted us to see. This is the nature of that death cult. They were proud of their acts of barbarity and terrorism, and they wanted the world to see what they had done. And I found that distressing, chilling, and supported wholeheartedly, and still support wholeheartedly, Israel's right to defend itself, its responsibility to get the hostages back, including British citizens, and also its duty to degrade Hamas's military capability and ability to carry out further attacks.
Do you think this is in Israel's interest now?
Where I've been horrified is the international community was clear with Israel. Right to defend yourself, responsibility to take out Hamas, also responsibility to act within international law.
Have they gone too far?
And the conduct. Well, when you've got President Biden accusing Israel of indiscriminate killing, I mean, that is extraordinary criticism from the President of the United States towards an Israeli government. And when you look at the scale of civilian losses, when you look at the deeply distressing images coming out of Gaza, I don't see how we can look at those numbers, look at those images and say this is simply self-defence and taking out Hamas's capability.
So the answer is yes, Israel has gone too far.
Israel has gone too far. And here's the other thing that I found particularly appalling as a Christian in the last day or so. We've had Israeli government spokespeople claiming that there are no Christians and no churches in Gaza, at the same time as my Liberal Democrat colleague, Layla Moran, is reporting that her family, who are Gazan Palestinian Christians, are sheltering in a church which is under sniper fire. I know who I believe, and it's my Liberal Democrat colleague. So I would just urge Israel to heed the advice of its friends at this time and conduct itself
They're
within
dancing
international
on the head
law.
of a pin at the moment. They're saying, a sort of a permanent sort of cessation, or a cessation that's sustainable, or a sustainable ceasefire. Would you like to hear your leader say Israel's gone too far? This is not in anyone's interest to keep up this kind of bombardment.
Well, I mean, I think Keir has been critical, and so has David Lammy. I think that in terms of the ceasefire itself, and I've had this debate with lots of my constituents who've wanted Labour to call for an immediate ceasefire. The challenge I've put back to my constituents is, in order to achieve a ceasefire, you need an agreement from both parties to the conflict. And we felt, and I think events justified, a position that said, look, we're not going to achieve a ceasefire at this stage, but let's try and go for a humanitarian pause, which is not a panacea, but is a start. And that 7 days stopped the killing, got people out of harm's way, got aid in, and got hostages back. But of course, it then failed. I think what the international community needs to do at this stage is try and kickstart again a political process out of this conflict.
That's on the international community, isn't it? That they didn't use that opportunity to say more at the time.
Well, it's difficult, and I don't pretend any of this is easy. And there's a reason this conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, has been intractable for decades. It has not been easy to solve.
And I just want to ask you finally. You're a constituency MP with a high Jewish population, high Muslim population. There have been protests outside your constituency. Have you felt threatened? How has it manifested itself?
No, I've not felt. I mean, I have had threats, and for the first time in my 8.5 years as a member of Parliament, I've had a death threat, which was a not pleasant experience, and it's meant I've had to change some of the way I do my work and the way I go about my life, which has not been brilliant. But no, do I feel threatened? No. I mean, I live in my constituency. I stood in Ilford North because it was my home, and I'm very proud to represent my community. And, in terms of the protests outside my office, one of the things actually firstly, I support people's right to protest, and if people are unhappy with me, they're perfectly within their rights to protest. I also actually appreciated the fact they chose to protest at a weekend when my staff weren't there, so my staff weren't harassed going to and from work. But threatened by my constituents? No, I don't feel threatened. I know that people wanted us to go further and wanted me to go further than I have on the ceasefire. But as I've sort of said to people, look, we've got to try and get a realistic path out of this conflict. And when you've got Hamas saying they would repeat 710 again and again given the chance, and you've got Israel saying we're not going to have that, finding a political path out of this is not going to be easy, but it is necessary. And the other disturbing thing, someone who has been a long-standing supporter of an independent Palestinian state, I found some of the remarks coming out of the Israeli government chilling, and the remarks of the Israeli ambassador to the UK representing her government's position against the two-state solution utterly intolerable. There is no solution to this conflict, either for the Palestinians and their right to self-determination and freedom and statehood, or for Israel's long-term security that doesn't involve a safe and secure Palestinian state alongside a safe and secure Israel. And I think the international community needs to speak with one voice on that.
Just to wrap up, Wes, and in a sense to take us back to where we started, we understand that Labour's playing the long game now, right? You don't know when the next election will be. You've probably got that Liam Byrne note hanging round your collective neck saying there's no money left. But do you find it frustrating that the shadow cabinet, in virtually everything you say at the moment, everything you do, sounds so timid? You can't actually talk about the real investment you need to put into this country. You can't actually talk about the need for immigration because you think that will follow you. You can't actually talk about the foreign policy outrages that you're seeing and that you'd like to respond to your constituents with more. Do you feel like you're just in this sort of holding pen right now?
No, I don't feel like that. I think sort of my reflection on the last 8.5 years as an MP and 13 years of Labour in opposition is you've got to keep it credible, and we've got to balance.
Even if there's no real big vision, even if there's no optimism.
Oh, I feel really optimistic about the future of our country, and I feel really optimistic about what a Labour government will be able to achieve, especially if we are given a chance to deliver the decade of national renewal that this country needs. And I think we've got big ambitions in terms of not just the fastest growing economy in the G7, but making sure that growth and prosperity are shared in every part of the country, genuine levelling up. I think our ambitions on energy security and making sure this country creates new jobs in the green industries of the future, at the same time as bringing down our bills and reindustrialising parts of the country that have suffered enormous deindustrialisation, is a big, bold ambition. If we had an NHS that is able to get people seen when they need to be, I mean, that would be a revolutionary transformation from where we are today. And if we can create a country where children from working class backgrounds like mine can punch through the glass ceiling, that's a fundamentally different Britain to the one we live in now. And I think we've got a serious leader with a serious team and a serious plan to get there. So I don't feel maybe we need to be a bit more cheerful in the new year. But it is it's difficult when you're against this really challenging backdrop. And I think people are feeling the pinch in their own pockets at the moment. We're not pretending that addressing these challenges is going to be easy, but in that realism and in that credibility that Labour has lies the hope and possibility of a better future for our country, and that's a future I really hope we get the chance to build after the general election.
Wes Streeting, thank you. Merry
Sounds
Christmas.
like the end of West Wing, that. I could feel the sort of
music.
rallying, yeah, the swelling music and the flag
As
flying.
Jeb Bartlett goes through the portico and back to the residence.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wes, thank you
More
very
Wes
much.
Wing than West Wing.
Wes Wing.
No, I'm here all week.
There is no doubt that Wes Streeting is a very impressive performer. Even when he goes beyond what is the party line, he knows how far he can go.
There's a little pause, isn't there, where you think, shall I go there, shall I go there? Oh, sod it, I will.
But I still think that actually when you were asking him about pay for people in social care, you saw the tension that there is within Labour over what to do about the National Health Service. Yeah, they want to reform, but they also want to pay people a lot more money. They want to cut waiting lists. And they're saying, well, we'll get economic growth and that will do the job for us.
I mean, fundamentally, for all this talk about trying to have honest conversations, they seem, at least rhetorically, to be falling back on, we're closing tax loopholes and we'll get more growth in the economy. How many times have you heard that from any incoming government, or from actually any government? They always fall back on the same things, which is this imaginary growth that is ahead of us, when actually the last 10 years have shown us very little of that. We don't know this would be the same, but there is nothing in the 13-year trajectory we've seen which suggests we are growing apace. And closing a non-dom tax loophole, which might land them £3 billion. Non-doms are particularly good at managing not to pay tax. We know that. So I'm not sure whether they'll all start paying up to the tune of at least £3 billion.
I suppose the only other postscript I would add to this is what you say pre-election.
Yeah.
He doesn't mind that he's offending some health service workers, because that will play well with this. Look, it's not a shrine. It's, the NHS is not the envy of the world. I'm the guy who's going to reform it. And I think he's saying stuff that no Tory would ever dare say, because they would be accused of privatisation. So I think that this is all quite deliberate now. I wonder whether the language changes if Labour do win the election and the pressure is even greater for a bit more money to go in.
I think that's right. But if you look at what's going on concurrently this morning, Rishi Sunak sitting before the Select Committee, where he is unable to point to an airline that would agree to take flights of asylum seekers to Rwanda. There isn't one, as far as we know, where he is unable to give us a date for when the small boats would stop. You can carry on saying stop the boats all you like, but if you're not actually putting a date on it, then, hey, who knows?
Maybe the slogan should have been stopping the boats rather than stop the boats.
Stop the boats one day.
Stopping the boats at some future date to be determined.
So if that's what you're up against, and you're still being super cautious in what you can actually pledge or stake, if that's what you're up against, why isn't Labour feeling able to just be a little bit more, a little bit bolder, a little bit less timid, a little bit less nervy round the edges?
I don't want to go all Lewis Goodall now, but, just with the Wes Streeting interview that we've just done and Rishi Sunak before the liaison committee, next year is going to be an absolute political corker, isn't it?
Yeah.
I feel a little nerdy attack of Goodallism.
I feel an attack of the lurgy. I'm going to go away now and cough.
You go and cough. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.